That morning I checked my bank account. It was completely empty. My son called and said, "Dad, my wedding is tomorrow. I withdrew all the money from your account and sold the house. Good luck." I said absolutely nothing and made a single phone call. When the wedding day arrived, he learned a very hard lesson. If you are watching this, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Let me tell you exactly how this nightmare started. It was a Friday morning, the kind of quiet, crisp Texas morning that makes you want to sit on the porch with a hot cup of black coffee and watch the sunrise. I am Victor Gallagher. I am 71 years old. I was sitting at my kitchen island tapping the screen of my tablet to pay my monthly utility bills. The house was peaceful. It had been overwhelmingly silent since my beautiful wife Diana passed away. I opened my banking application. My eyes adjusted to the bright screen. The number staring back at me was not the $485,000 I had secured just a week prior. The balance read $0.00. For a man who spent 30 years as a chief compliance officer, tracking offshore financial fraud for a major Chicago investment firm, you would think a suddenly emptied bank account would trigger a massive heart attack. You would think I would drop the tablet. You would think I would grasp my chest and gasp for air. But panic is the enemy of a clear mind. I did not gasp. I did not throw the tablet across the room. I just sat there and stared at the empty digital void. That $485,000 was not my retirement fund. It was the life insurance payout from my late wife, Diana. It was the exact amount of money we needed to lay the foundation for a youth shelter in her memory. It was her legacy. And now it was gone, evaporated into thin air. Before I could even process the mechanics of the missing funds, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the front hallway. I set my tablet down on the marble counter. I walked toward the foyer and found my front door wide open. Two men in thick work boots and dirty denim jackets were wrestling my antique mahogany console table out the door. The very same table Diana and I bought on our honeymoon in Charleston 40 years ago. I stepped forward and raised my hand. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was calm but carrying that undeniable weight of authority I used to reserve for embezzling corporate executives. "What exactly do you think you are doing with my furniture?" The taller of the two men paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "We are just doing our job, buddy," he said. "The new owner wants the place cleared out by noon." New owner. I repeated the words slowly, letting them sink into the quiet air of the hallway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my house keys. I walked over to the front door and tried to slide the key into the deadbolt. It would not go in. The lock had been changed. They had drilled it out and replaced it while I was sitting in my own kitchen. "I need to see your work order right now," I demanded. The second mover, a younger kid chewing gum, pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his clipboard and handed it to me. I unfolded it. There it was in black and white. An expedited estate clearance order, and right there at the bottom on the authorization line was a signature I would recognize anywhere in the world. The loopy, hurried handwriting of my 32-year-old son, Derek, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had bailed out of college debt. He had authorized a crew of strangers to strip my home bare. I stood in my own hallway, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood, knowing it might be the last time I smelled it. The movers watched me closely, expecting the typical reaction of an old man losing his mind. They expected tears. They expected shouting. They expected me to call the police and make a huge scene. But like I said, panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are being robbed. In my career, I have dismantled corporate thieves who hid millions of dollars in shell companies across the globe. I know exactly how criminals operate. I know their arrogance. I know their blind spots. And the absolute first rule of catching a thief is to let them think they have gotten away with it. You let them get comfortable. You let them celebrate. I folded the paper and handed it back to the kid. All right, I said smoothly. Just be careful with the legs on that table. The wood is very old and fragile. The movers looked at each other, totally confused by my lack of resistance, but they shrugged and carried the table out to the idling truck in the driveway. I walked back into the kitchen. The house was already echoing. It felt hollow and cold. I picked up my tablet again and looked at the zero balance. Derek was getting married tomorrow. An extravagant $200,000 outdoor wedding to a woman named Brooke. Brooke was a woman who looked at me like I was a stain on her designer shoes. Derek had been complaining about money for months. He had maxed out his credit, trying to keep up with Brooke and her expensive, luxurious lifestyle. I had absolutely refused to pay for the wedding because I knew Brooke was just using him for his perceived wealth. I told him he needed to learn financial responsibility and stand on his own 2 feet. Apparently, this was his twisted version of taking initiative. He decided to steal his dead mother's legacy to fund a party. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, calculating clarity wash over me. Every emotion shut down and the forensic accountant inside me woke up. I walked out the back door and stood in the beautiful garden Diana had planted. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I did not call the police. The police would just see a domestic dispute. They would see a confused old man and a son claiming some kind of misunderstanding. No, this situation required a much more precise weapon. I dialed the number of my lawyer, Martin Rosenberg. Martin, I said as soon as he picked up. Execute Plan B. The kid took the bait. Martin did not ask questions. He knew exactly what Plan B meant. He simply said, considered it done, and hung up. But a good investigator knows that circumstantial evidence is never enough. I needed a confession. I needed the arrogance of the perpetrator captured in real time. I pressed the record button on my encrypted application and dialed my son's number. The phone rang 3 times. With each ring, I looked at the empty space in my living room where the antique table used to sit. I imagined the empty bank account. I thought about the $485,000. That money had a purpose. When Diana was in her final days lying in the hospice bed, her breathing shallow and her hands incredibly frail, she made me promise her one thing. She did not want a massive stone monument. She did not want her name on a hospital wing. She wanted a sanctuary for children who had no one. She had been an orphan herself, navigating the cold foster care system until she aged out. We had spent the last 2 years of her life planning the Diana Gallagher Youth Shelter. Every penny of that life insurance policy was destined to buy a defunct community center on the east side of town. The closing date was supposed to be next month, and now her own son had stolen her final wish to pay for an open bar and a string quartet. The line clicked open. A blast of heavy thumping bass music immediately assaulted my ear. It was the unmistakable sound of a high-end day party. I could hear the clinking of champagne flutes and the loud, obnoxious laughter of people who had not worked a hard day in their lives. "Hello." Derek's voice was slightly slurred. He was shouting over the music. He sounded annoyed that the incoming call had interrupted his celebration. "Derek," I said. My voice was completely flat. "There are movers in my house taking my furniture, and my primary bank account has been completely drained." "Where are you?" There was a pause on the other end. I heard him say something to someone nearby. "Hold my drink, babe." It was Brooke. I could hear her shrill voice in the background asking who was bothering them. "It is just my dad," Derek muttered to her. The music faded slightly, as if he had stepped into a hallway or a private room. "Dad, listen to me carefully," Derek said. The slurring was gone, replaced by a cold, condescending tone, a tone he had undoubtedly practiced in the mirror. "My wedding is tomorrow. This is the most important weekend of my life. I withdrew the money, and I sold the house." "You sold my house?" I asked. I made sure to enunciate every word for the recording. And you stole nearly $500,000 of your mother's money. It is not stealing, Dad. Derek sighed heavily, as if he were explaining basic math to a toddler. You are old. You are not thinking clearly anymore. After your stroke last year, you have been slipping. We both know it. Brooke and I talked about it. You do not need a massive house all to yourself, and you definitely do not need hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a checking account doing nothing. We are putting that money to good use. We are building our future. Your future, I repeated. The audacity of his words hung in the air. You are stealing the foundation money for your mother's youth shelter to pay for your wedding. Oh, please, Dad, Derek scoffed. A harsh, cruel sound. Mom is gone. A shelter is not going to bring her back. You are living in the past. Brooke and I have actual lives to lead. We have a status to maintain. You were just going to throw that money away on some charity case kids anyway. Consider this an early inheritance. I saved you the trouble of managing an estate. I stood in the driveway gripping the phone. The Texas sun was beating down on my shoulders, but I felt absolute ice in my veins. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it transcended anger. It became a mathematical equation. He was no longer my son. He was a hostile entity. Where am I supposed to live, Derek? I asked, playing the role of the helpless victim perfectly. That is not my problem anymore, Dad. Put yourself in a nursing home. The proceeds from whatever junk the movers manage to sell should cover your first few months. You will be safer there anyway, with professionals watching you. Good luck. The line went dead. A sharp dial tone echoed in my ear. I slowly lowered the phone. Good luck. Those were his final words to the man who gave him life, to the man who worked 80-hour weeks to put him through college, to the man who loved his mother more than anything in this world. I looked down at the recording application on my screen. The file was securely saved. 1 minute and 42 seconds of pure, unadulterated fraud and elder abuse. I walked back toward the house. The movers had finished loading the living room. They were now heading upstairs toward the master bedroom. They were going to pack up Diana's clothes. They were going to quench her jewelry box. They were going to strip away the last physical traces of my life with her. Any normal person would have stopped them. Any normal father would have called the local police and tried to get his house back immediately. But I knew that if I intervened now, I would only catch Derek on a minor domestic dispute. Brooke would hire a slick lawyer. They would claim a misunderstanding about the estate planning. They would tie me up in civil court for years while they spent Diana's money. I could not let them win easily today. I turned my back on the movers and walked down the driveway toward my car. It was an unassuming dark blue sedan, parked quietly under the shade of a large oak tree. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and closed myself inside the quiet cabin. The heavy thud of the car door shutting blocked out the sounds of my home being dismantled. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a matte black laptop. Derek always made fun of me for carrying it around. He thought I was just an old man clinging to outdated technology. He frequently bragged about his latest smartphone and his expensive tablets, assuming that, because my hair was gray, I barely knew how to send an email. He did not realize that the very banking applications he used on his fancy phone were built on security protocols I helped design back in the late 90s. I was not a tech-illiterate boomer fumbling with passwords. I was the architect of the walls he thought he had just breached. I powered on the machine and bypassed the standard operating system, booting directly into a secure, encrypted environment. I connected to a private mobile hotspot and routed my connection through 3 separate virtual private networks. If I was going to hunt down nearly $500,000, I was not going to leave a digital trail for anyone to follow. I opened my banking dashboard. The consumer-facing application on my tablet had shown a simple 0 balance, but I needed the raw data. I bypassed the user interface and accessed the detailed transaction logs. the screen filled with lines of code routing numbers and timestamps. My eyes scanned the green text against the black background, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades hunting financial ghosts. There it was, an outgoing wire transfer executed at 8:14 yesterday morning. The exact amount was $485,000. I highlighted the receiving routing number. It was not a local transfer. Derek had not just moved the money into his own checking account down the street. He had used a third-party clearinghouse to bounce the funds before landing them in a newly established high-yield account. I ran the routing number through a financial database I still had access to. The destination was a regional bank headquartered in Dallas, Texas. My primary account, the one holding Diana's life insurance payout, was based out of Delaware. I leaned back in my seat and let out a slow, deep breath. My son was not just a thief. He was remarkably ignorant of federal banking regulations. By moving that amount of stolen money across state lines, he had instantly elevated a domestic dispute into a federal crime. He had committed wire fraud. The FBI would not treat this as a family disagreement over an inheritance. They would treat it as a major felony. I began compiling the digital footprint. I downloaded the wire transfer authorization forms, the timestamp logs, and the IP addresses used to initiate the transaction. With every click of my mouse, I was forging a nail for my son's coffin. I discovered that the transfer had been authorized using a digital signature. Derek had uploaded a document to the bank to bypass the fraud alert triggers. I pulled up the attachment. It was a scan of a legal document. I squinted at the screen, zooming in on the pixelated image. It was a medical and financial power of attorney. My stomach tightened. I recognized the document immediately, but something was fundamentally wrong with it. Derek had claimed I was losing my mind. He was using a temporary power of attorney I had signed last year when I had a minor stroke, but that document had an expiration date. I had revoked it the moment I was discharged from the hospital. I looked closer at the date on the scanned document. It had been crudely altered. The year had been changed. Derek had forged my legal documents to convince the bank he had the authority to drain my accounts. This was no longer just theft or wire fraud. This was aggravated identity theft and document forgery. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of federal offenses. I saved every single file into an encrypted folder and backed it up to a secure cloud server. I made a secondary copy and sent it directly to Martin's private server. The evidence was now indestructible. Derek thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought he had outmaneuvered a frail old man who would just cry and accept his fate in a cheap nursing home. He had no idea he had just walked into a trap of his own making. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully back into the glove compartment. I looked out the car window. The movers were securing the heavy ramp on the back of their truck. They had taken everything of value. The house I had shared with Diana was now nothing more than an empty wooden shell. But I did not feel the crushing weight of loss anymore. I felt the cold, sharp edge of absolute resolve. I started the engine of my sedan. The quiet hum of the motor filled the cabin. I adjusted my rearview mirror and took one last look at the property. Derek and Brooke were currently hosting an extravagant rehearsal dinner at a massive rented mansion across town. They were drinking expensive champagne and laughing with their wealthy friends, celebrating a future built entirely on my stolen money. It was time for me to pay my respects to the happy couple. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the long driveway, leaving my empty house behind. I drove away completely silently. The hunt had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until I burned their stolen empire to the ground. I drove my sedan to a parking garage and left it there. I did not want my familiar car parked outside, giving them advance warning. Instead, I requested a black car through the Uber application. The driver was a quiet man who kept the radio volume low, which I appreciated. I needed silence to focus on the performance I was about to deliver. The ride to the western hills of Austin took 40 minutes. We pulled up to a massive iron gate. The property was a sprawling modern glass and stone mansion that Derek and Brooke rented for the entire weekend. It was the exaggerated luxury that people with no actual wealth loved to show off. The driver rolled down his window and gave my name to the security guard. Since guests were still arriving, the guard simply nodded and waved us through. We drove up a long, winding driveway lined with imported palm trees and expensive sports cars. I thanked the driver, stepped out of the vehicle, and straightened my casual khaki jacket. I was not dressed for a high society evening. I was wearing the clothes I had put on to drink my morning coffee. I was not there to impress anyone. I walked up the wide stone steps toward the massive double doors. They were propped open to let the cool evening breeze flow through the house. The sound of live jazz music drifted out into the night air, accompanied by the low hum of wealthy people trying very hard to sound important. I stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer. The interior was blindingly white. White marble floors, white leather furniture, and massive modern art pieces. Caterers in crisp black uniforms moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of delicate appetizers and tall glasses of expensive champagne. The guests were dressed in tailored suits and designer cocktail gowns. I stood near the entryway, letting the sheer arrogance of the room wash over me. Every single bite of caviar, every drop of that vintage champagne, and every hour this rented mansion cost was paid for by the money they stole from my dead wife. I scanned the room looking for the two people responsible. It did not take long to find her. Brooke was holding court near a massive indoor waterfall feature. She was wearing a sleek, pearl-colored silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told, throwing her head back to make sure the photographer hired for the evening captured her perfect angle. As she lowered her glass, her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. The fake smile on her face completely vanished. It was as if someone had physically struck her. She blinked twice, unable to comprehend how the pathetic old man they had just evicted was standing in the middle of her perfect rehearsal dinner. Her eyes darted around the room, checking to see if any of her wealthy friends had noticed my presence. Satisfied that no one was paying attention to the wrinkled old man by the door, she abruptly excused herself. She handed her half-empty champagne flute to a passing waiter and marched toward me. Her high heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, sounding like a ticking metronome counting down to an explosion. I stood my ground and waited. I let my shoulders slump slightly, and I softened my expression. I needed her to see weakness. I needed her to feel superior so she would make mistakes. Brooke did not stop until she was inches from my face. She strategically positioned her body to block me from the view of the main dining hall. Her perfume was incredibly strong and suffocating. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was laced with absolute venom. "You were not invited to this dinner, Victor." I looked around the room, pretending to be confused and slightly intimidated. "I just needed to speak with my son," I said, letting my voice tremble just a fraction. "I went to the house and there were men taking my things." Brooke grabbed my arm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into my wrist. She squeezed hard enough to leave marks. "Keep your voice down, you crazy old fool," she ordered. Her eyes were wide with furious panic. "Look at you. You look like a homeless person who wandered off the street. You are wearing dirty khakis at a formal event. You are completely ruining my aesthetic. Do you have any idea who is in that room right now? There are investors and influencers here. My brand depends on this weekend looking flawless." I gently tried to pull my arm away, but her grip tightened. "I do not care about your brand, Brooke," I said, maintaining the facade of a distressed father. "I care about my home. I care about the money Derek took from my account. I have nowhere to sleep tonight." She let out a very short and cruel laugh. "That is exactly why Derek took over your finances, Victor. You are clearly deteriorating. You cannot even dress yourself appropriately for a social gathering, let alone manage hundreds of thousands of dollars. We are doing you a massive favor right now. You need to turn around, walk out that front door, and call a cab. If you cause a scene and embarrass my husband in front of these important people, I swear I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life locked in a state-run mental facility." She leaned in closer so only I could hear her next words. "You have absolutely zero power here, old man. You are completely broke. You are officially homeless, and you are a disgusting stain on this absolutely perfect weekend. Leave right now before I have the private security guards drag you outside and throw you onto the literal street." Before she could summon the guards, a hand firmly grabbed my shoulder. It was Derek. He smelled of expensive cologne and expensive dark scotch. "Brooke is right, Dad," he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "You should not be here. But since you are, we need to settle this away from my guests." He did not wait for my response. He tightened his grip on my shoulder and practically dragged me down a long hallway away from the music and the laughter. We entered a private study. It was a heavy room with dark oak-paneled walls and tall, heavy wooden bookshelves that looked like they had never been touched. Derek closed the heavy wooden door behind us, instantly cutting off the sounds of the party. The silence in the room was oppressive. He walked over to a massive mahogany desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. He looked at me not with the love of a son, but with the cold calculation of a man who was trying to manage a nuisance. I stood near the door, letting my hands shake slightly. I kept my head lowered. "What is this, Derek?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Why are there men taking your mother's furniture? Why is my bank account empty?" Derek sighed loudly, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if I were giving him a terrible headache. "Dad." "We talked about this," he lied smoothly. "Do you really not remember?" My heart hardened, but my physical facade remained that of a confused, vulnerable senior citizen. "Remember what I stammered. I never agreed to sell my home. I never agreed to give you your mother's foundation money." Derek reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper and tossed it onto the desk between us. "I had to step in, Dad," he said. His tone shifted from angry to mock sympathetic. "You are not well. Ever since your stroke last year, your cognitive decline has been obvious to everyone. You forget things. You get confused. Leaving you alone in that big house with access to that much money was simply irresponsible. I could not sit back and watch you become a victim of some scam artist. I am your son. It is my job to protect you." I slowly approached the desk. My hands trembled violently as I reached out to pick up the document. It was a copy of a medical and financial power of attorney, the very same document I had seen on my laptop earlier. But holding the physical paper in my hands, feeling the weight of his absolute betrayal made the air in the room feel thick and suffocating. I stared at the black ink on the page. He was using my stroke as his ultimate weapon. My mind drifted back to that terrible week last year. I had collapsed in the kitchen. I woke up 2 days later in a sterile hospital room surrounded by beeping machines. The left side of my body was entirely numb. I was terrified. The nurse had asked me if there was family she could call. I gave her Derek's number. She called him 3 times. He never answered. He did not answer because he and Brooke were on a beach in Cabo San Lucas drinking margaritas. I knew this because while I was lying in a hospital bed wondering if I would ever walk again, the nurses took pity on me and helped me check my social media. I saw his posts. I saw the pictures of them laughing in the sun while I was fighting for my life in the shadows. I recovered completely alone. I pushed through grueling physical therapy completely alone. I regained my strength, my speech, and my mind completely alone. And now he was standing in front of me dressed in a tuxedo paid for with my money, using the very illness he ignored to declare me incompetent. "It is all completely legal, Dad," Derek said, watching me stare blankly at the paper. "You signed it yourself. The doctors agreed that you needed supervision. I transferred the funds into a secure trust that I currently manage. The house was too much of a liability, so I liquidated it to cover your future care. You do not have to worry about bills or maintenance anymore. I have taken the heavy burden off your aging shoulders. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you," I whispered. My voice was barely audible. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound disgust. Derek misread it entirely. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had finally forced me to accept my new pathetic reality. "Yes, Dad, thanking me," he replied, stepping closer. He patted my shoulder with a condescending rhythm. "Now I need you to go home." "Well, not home. Go to a hotel. I will have my assistant book you a room for the weekend. After the wedding, we will look into a nice assisted living facility, somewhere quiet. You will make friends. It will be good for you." I kept my eyes glued to the forged date on the power of attorney. The numbers had been blatantly altered to make the expired temporary document appear permanent. He was incredibly arrogant. He was so convinced of his own superior intelligence that he did not even realize the massive legal trap he had just confirmed by handing me this piece of paper. I slowly folded the document and slipped it into my pocket. Derek smiled, looking incredibly proud of himself. He thought he had just won the ultimate victory. He thought he had successfully erased my entire life without facing a single consequence. I nodded weakly, turned my back on my only son, and walked quietly out of the room, completely ready to destroy his pathetic little empire tomorrow. As my hand reached for the heavy brass doorknob, the thick wooden door suddenly swung open inward. Brooke stood in the threshold, blocking my exit. She had clearly been listening from the hallway, waiting for the perfect moment to make her entrance. She looked past me to Derek, who gave her a subtle nod of victory, indicating that I had been dealt with and neutralized. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. It was the kind of smile a predator gives a wounded animal when the hunt is finally over. She stepped fully into the study, closing the door slightly behind her to trap me in the small space between them. "You really thought you could come here and make demands?" she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You really thought you had some sort of power left in this family?" She reached inside, searching for something. She pulled out a crisp new $100 bill. She held it up between her index and middle fingers, dangling it in front of my face like a piece of meat. She took a step closer until I could smell the overpowering scent of her expensive perfume again. With a swift, demeaning motion, she shoved the folded bill directly into the front breast pocket of my jacket. She patted the pocket twice as if she were rewarding a stray dog. "Take a taxi to a cheap motel." "Old man," she whispered, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "Buy yourself a hot meal and go to sleep. And do not even think about showing your face at the venue tomorrow. You are not needed. Do not ruin my photos tomorrow." I looked down at the green edge of the bill sticking out of my pocket. I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. I let my lower lip tremble. I let my shoulders drop another inch. I reached up and placed my hand over the pocket, holding the money close to my chest as if it were my last lifeline. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice thick with fake emotion. I bowed my head submissively, completely avoiding her gaze. I slipped past her through the doorway, leaving her and Derek alone in their temporary fortress of stolen wealth. I walked back down the long hallway, moving slowly and unsteadily. I passed the grand foyer where the jazz music was still playing, and the wealthy guests were still laughing. None of them paid any attention to the old man shuffling out the front door. They were too busy celebrating a marriage built on a foundation of absolute lies. I stepped out into the cool night air and began the long walk down the winding driveway toward the front gate where I had arranged for another car to pick me up. With every step I took away from the mansion, my posture began to change. The pathetic old man vanished into the darkness, leaving only the cold, calculating forensic investigator in his place. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crisp $100 bill Brooke had just shoved into my chest. I stared at Benjamin Franklin's face under the dim glow of a street lamp. She thought this piece of paper was the ultimate insult. She thought she had purchased my dignity for a single $100 bill. But she was entirely wrong. This piece of paper was just a physical manifestation of her unbelievable arrogance. And arrogance is always the fatal flaw in every criminal conspiracy I have ever dismantled. I folded the bill neatly and slid it into my wallet. I would keep it as a souvenir. My fingers brushed against the folded medical and financial power of attorney that Derek had given me. The air was cool, but my mind was burning with absolute clarity. The legal trap was now fully armed and locked. When Derek stood in that study and smugly handed me a forged legal document, he fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. If he had simply stolen cash from a safe in my home, it would have been a terrible betrayal and a local police matter. But he was greedy, and he was incredibly sloppy. He used an altered legal document to authorize a massive wire transfer of $485,000, and he routed those funds from a bank in Delaware to a bank in Texas. The moment those digitized funds crossed the state line, his crime escalated from local theft to federal wire fraud. It is one of the most severe financial crimes in the United States Criminal Code. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not take wire fraud lightly. The penalties are incredibly severe, especially when the victim is a senior citizen and the amount exceeds certain thresholds. He had practically handed me the weapon for his own destruction. Furthermore, the act of altering the date on the power of attorney constituted aggravated identity theft and document forgery. Each of these offenses carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. Brooke and Derek thought they were playing a simple game of family politics. They thought they were just outsmarting a senile father who would eventually surrender. They did not realize they had just triggered a federal investigation that would completely destroy their lives. I reached the bottom of the driveway and stood by the massive iron gates waiting for my ride. The night was quiet. The jazz music from the mansion was just a faint whisper in the wind. I felt a deep sense of absolute peace wash over me. I was focused entirely on the execution of justice. The bait had been taken. The evidence was secured on multiple encrypted servers. All that was left to do was spring the mechanism. I watched the headlights of my approaching car cut through the darkness. Tomorrow, they were going to have a beautiful wedding, and I was going to give them a wedding gift they would never forget for the rest of their miserable lives. The black car arrived at the driveway. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. I gave the driver an address in downtown Austin. The ride through the dark city was perfectly quiet. My mind was no longer focused on the mansion or the rehearsal dinner. I was preparing for the clinical execution of justice. We pulled up to a towering glass high-rise. It was 11:30 at night. The lobby was completely deserted, except for a single security guard reading a book behind a marble counter. He nodded at me as I walked toward the elevators. I pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator hummed quietly as it carried me up. The doors opened to the dark reception area. A single light shone at the far end. It spilled from Martin Rosenberg's office. Martin was not just my lawyer. He was a former federal prosecutor who worked alongside me investigating financial fraud. He knew my methods. He knew my mind. And he knew my late wife, Diana. I pushed the door open. Martin was sitting behind his heavy oak desk. His tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated a thick stack of printed documents. These were the digital files I transferred to his server. He looked up over his reading glasses as I entered the room. "You look terrible, Victor," he said. I sat down and let out a long breath. "I feel incredibly clear, Martin," I replied. "Have you reviewed the files I asked?" Martin nodded slowly. He tapped the stack of papers with his pen. "It is all here. The wire transfer logs, the destination numbers, the altered timestamps, and the forged power of attorney. Derek was stupid to use a clearinghouse. He left a digital trail a mile wide. I spent the last 3 hours drafting the official report for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have also prepared the emergency injunctions to freeze the receiving accounts in Dallas. The moment the banks open on Monday morning, those funds will be locked down tighter than a drum. But the FBI does not wait for banking hours when wire fraud of this magnitude is reported. We can submit this directly to the Cybercrimes Division right now. Martin leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses. He looked at me with a profound sadness. For 20 years I have known you, Victor. I have watched you dismantle ruthless corporate criminals without blinking an eye. But this is different. This is Derek. I watched that boy grow up. I attended his high school graduation. I ate dinner at your table with Diana while he played in the backyard. Martin leaned forward and rested his arms on the desk. He folded his hands together. I need to ask you this as your legal counsel and as your friend. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Once we file this report, there is no retracting it. This is not a civil suit. This is a federal felony. They will arrest him. He will face severe mandatory prison time. Your only son will become a convicted felon. Are you prepared to send your own flesh and blood to federal prison? The only sound was the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the office. I looked at the pen resting on top of the FBI report. For a brief moment, the image of Derek as a little boy flashed in my mind. A boy with scraped knees and a bright smile. But that boy was gone. He had been replaced by a selfish, arrogant thief who stood in a rented mansion and told his father to go die in a cheap motel. Blood is a biological accident, Martin, I said softly but firmly. It is not a free pass to commit atrocities against the people who brought you into this world. I raised him to understand right from wrong. I paid for his education. I gave him every opportunity to become a decent, honorable man. He made his choices. He chose to look at my temporary physical weakness after my stroke as a permanent opportunity for exploitation. He chose to steal the money intended for orphans to fund a ridiculous party. I walked over to the large window and stared outside. True family is built on mutual respect and unconditional love. It is not an entitlement program. Diana and I worked our entire lives to build something meaningful. She wanted to leave a legacy of kindness. Derek tried to pave over her grave with a $200,000 wedding. If I let him walk away with this, I am not protecting him. I am simply validating his cruelty. I am teaching him that there are absolutely no consequences for destroying another human being as long as you share their last name. I will not allow the memory of my wife to be financed into his pathetic illusion of wealth. I turned back to the desk. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I did not let my hand shake. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line on the final page of the FBI report. The ink flowed smoothly across the crisp white paper. I signed my name with the exact same firm, deliberate strokes I had used my entire professional career. I placed the pen back onto the desk and pushed the document toward Martin. I am completely sure, I said. My voice was steady and absolute. Spring the trap immediately. Martin looked at the signature. He let out a quiet sigh of resignation. He opened his laptop and scanned the signed page into the secure federal portal. With one click of his mouse, the encrypted file was sent directly to the Cybercrimes Division. The mechanism of justice was now officially in motion. I slept 4 hours on the vintage leather sofa in Martin's office. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce the glass windows. It was Saturday. It was the morning of my son's wedding. Caterers were arranging expensive flowers and velvet chairs on a manicured lawn. Inside the quiet law office, there was no celebration. There was only stale coffee and the hum of computer servers. Martin walked into the room holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee and a fresh stack of manila folders. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He handed me a mug and dropped the folders onto the heavy oak desk with a loud thud. "The Cybercrimes Division acknowledged our file at 3 in the morning," Martin said, taking a sip. "They officially opened a case. The wheels are turning." While waiting, I dug into the secondary part of Derek's financial scheme. I pulled the property records. I stood and walked over to the desk. The coffee burned my throat, but it woke up my senses. "The house," I said softly. "Derek told me he liquidated the house to cover my future care in an assisted living facility." I assumed he had just initiated a standard listing agreement with a crooked real estate agent. Martin shook his head and opened the top folder. "He did not list the house, Victor. He sold it. The transaction was finalized and recorded electronically late yesterday afternoon." I stared at the official county deed transfer document. The numbers printed on it made absolutely no sense. The house Diana and I built had a market valuation of at least $1.2 million. It was located in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the entire state. But the sale price listed on the deed was exactly $600,000, half of its actual value. I traced my finger over the printed numbers. He sold $1 million estate for $600,000. I muttered, my mind quickly processing the mathematics of the crime. He took a 50% loss on the greatest asset in the portfolio. Why would he do that? "Because he did not care about the long-term value," Martin replied, leaning against the edge of the desk. "He cared about liquidity. Look at the terms of the sale. It was an all-cash transaction. No mortgage contingencies, no structural inspections, no standard 30-day escrow period. He surrendered the deed for a duffel bag of digital cash." The reality hit me like a blow. Derek was not just stealing my money for a wedding. The wedding was just a smokescreen. The $200,000 party was designed to make him look incredibly successful and deeply rooted in the community. But behind the scenes, he was executing a massive fire sale. He drained the $485,000 from the life insurance policy. He liquidated the real estate for another $600,000 in pure cash. He had gathered over $1 million in untraceable liquid assets in less than 48 hours. "He is running," I said, looking up at Martin. "He is not planning to stay in Austin. He and Brooke are planning to take the money and flee the country immediately after the reception. They will probably hop on a plane to somewhere with favorable extradition laws under the guise of an extended luxury honeymoon. By the time anyone realizes the money is completely gone and the property is legally tangled, they will be sitting on a beach halfway across the world." Martin nodded in agreement. That is the only logical explanation for taking such a massive loss on the property. He needed the cash instantly. But that brings us to the most confusing part of this entire transaction. Martin flipped to the second page of the file. "In all my years of practicing real estate and financial law, I have never seen a property close this fast. The title search alone usually takes a week. To execute a cash transfer and record a deed in under 24 hours requires an incredibly motivated buyer, someone who is willing to bypass all standard legal protections and cut massive corners." I looked down at the buyer information on the deed. The space where a family name or a standard property management firm should have been was occupied by a corporate entity. The new legal owner of my home was listed as Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. Apex Holdings, I read the name aloud. It sounded exactly like the type of generic shell company criminals use to wash dirty money. Who is behind it? "That is the million-dollar question," Martin said, tapping the paper. I ran a preliminary search on the Texas Secretary of State Business Registry. Apex Holdings was incorporated exactly 3 days ago. It has no prior business history. It has no listed physical office address other than a generic post office box in a strip mall. And the registered agent is shielded by a third-party anonymity service. Someone created this company specifically to buy your house. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. Derek's arrogance had blinded him, but he was not a criminal mastermind. He did not know how to set up shell companies or have connections to underworld buyers who could produce untraceable cash overnight. Someone else was pulling the strings on this real estate deal. Someone with a deep understanding of how to exploit a desperate, greedy young man. "I need access to your premium software, Martin," I said, setting my mug down. "The public registries are not going to give us the name of the real buyer. But every single limited liability company leaves a digital financial footprint. They had to wire that $600,000 from somewhere. And I am going to find out exactly who handed my son the match he used to burn down my legacy." Martin stepped aside and let me take his leather chair. I opened a specialized data terminal on his secure computer network. This software was not available to the general public. It was a proprietary forensic database used by federal investigators to trace dark money across international borders. A domestic shell company like Apex Holdings might fool a local tax assessor, but to this system it was practically transparent. I began running a reverse trace on the corporate registration number. The anonymity service shielding the owner was based in Nevada. I bypassed their firewall by cross-referencing the digital payment method used to file the initial incorporation documents. Criminals often remember to hide their names, but they almost always forget to hide the credit card they use to pay the filing fees. Lines of data scrolled rapidly across the bright monitor. I watched as the software peeled back the layers of deception. Within 10 minutes, the system flagged a direct match. The credit card used to establish Apex Holdings belonged to an individual residing right here in Austin. The screen refreshed and a name appeared in bold black text. Chad. No massive corporate conglomerate. No sophisticated syndicate of offshore real estate investors. Just a single individual named Chad. I typed his full name into a secondary public records database. He had a few minor traffic violations and a dismissed civil suit for unpaid rent, but no major criminal history. What he lacked in criminal sophistication, he made up for in an aggressive social media presence. I opened a standard internet browser and navigated to popular social media platforms. I typed his name into the search bar. His profile was entirely public. The page was a nauseating shrine to superficial vanity. There were hundreds of photographs of a heavily muscled man in his late 20s posing in gyms, drinking protein shakes, and standing near leased luxury cars. His profile bio listed him as an elite personal fitness coach and a lifestyle entrepreneur. I scrolled through his posts, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. I knew exactly where this was going, but I needed visual confirmation. I clicked on a photo album tagged with a location in downtown Austin. It was a high-end private training facility, and there she was. Brooke. My future daughter-in-law was featured prominently in dozens of his videos and photographs. In some, she was lifting weights while he spotted her with his hands lingering entirely too close to her waist. In others, they were taking mirror selfies together, their bodies pressed tightly against one another, smiling brightly for the camera. The captions were full of heart symbols and inside jokes. She called him her daily motivation. He called her his favorite client. But the body language in these images told a completely different story. It was not a professional relationship. It was intimate. It was arrogant. It was deeply sickening. Chad was not just a fitness trainer who decided to pivot into real estate investing overnight. He was Brooke's lover. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening finality. Derek was completely oblivious. He thought he was the mastermind of this grand financial escape. He thought he was liquidating my assets to fund his beautiful future with his perfect wife. But Derek was just a useful idiot. Brooke and Chad orchestrated the entire real estate transaction. Brooke manipulated my son into selling the property at a massive financial loss, knowing that Chad had formed a shell company to purchase it. They were using Derek's own greed to rob him blind. Once the wedding was completely over, and Derek was left holding the bag for the federal wire fraud, Brooke and Chad would take all the cash, the house, and disappear. I pushed the chair back and stood up from the desk. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness. It was a physical reaction to the sheer magnitude of the disrespect. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city skyline. I closed my eyes and thought about my house. It was not just a building constructed from wood and stone. When Diana and I bought that plot of land 40 years ago, we could not afford to hire a massive construction crew. I laid the foundation myself. I framed the walls with my own hands, working late into the night, under the glow of a halogen worklight. I sanded the hardwood floors until my fingers bled. Every single nail in that house was driven with the intention of building a safe sanctuary for my family. We raised our son in those rooms. We celebrated birthdays and holidays in that living room. I held my wife in my arms in that bedroom when she took her last breath. The house was a physical manifestation of a lifetime of hard work and unwavering love, and my son had handed the keys to a sleazy fitness trainer so his cheating fiancée could steal our legacy. The profound insult of it burned in my chest like a physical fire. They had taken something sacred and turned it into a cheap hustle to fund their pathetic, superficial lifestyle. Martin watched me from the doorway. He had seen the photographs on the monitor. He knew exactly what this meant. "This changes everything," Victor Martin said quietly. "It is not just your son anymore." I turned away from the window. My voice was dangerously calm. "No, it does not change everything at all, Martin," I replied. "It simply expands the entire blast radius of the situation." Derek betrayed his father for money. Brooke betrayed Derek for the exact same terrible thing. They are all infected with the exact same disease. They actually believe that they are smarter than everyone else because they have no moral compass. But they forgot one fundamental rule. When you steal a house built by a forensic investigator, you should probably check the floorboards before you try to move in. Martin looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What exactly do you have in that house, Victor?" he asked. I walked back over to his heavy desk and reached for my laptop bag. "I did not wire the house with explosives, if that is what you are thinking," I said, pulling out my matte black computer. "But when you spend 30 years investigating people who lie for a living, you develop certain habits. I do not just trust locks and deadbolts. I trust verifiable data." I opened my laptop and connected it to Martin's secure network again. When Diana started getting sick, I installed a very comprehensive security system. I needed to monitor the house in case she fell or needed medical assistance while I was in another room. Derek knew about the cameras. He actually complained about them, constantly claiming they were an invasion of privacy whenever he came over. What Derek did not know is how those cameras actually operated. He possesses the technological understanding of a teenager. He thinks that if you unplug a device from the wall, it simply ceases to exist. He thinks pulling a power cord is the ultimate security measure. I logged into a highly encrypted offshore server. A grid of blank black squares appeared on my screen. Each square represented a different room in my house. The live feed was dead. Derek had indeed gone through the house and unplugged every single camera he could find before he brought the movers in. But he did not realize that the physical cameras were merely optical relays. The actual recording system was hardwired into an independent battery backup hidden inside the walls. Every single second of video and audio was instantly uploaded to a secure cloud server. The data was untouchable. I bypassed the dead live feed and accessed the archived storage. I needed to see exactly what happened in my house before the movers arrived. I selected the master timeline and began scrolling backward. Yesterday was a flurry of activity with Derek storming through the rooms holding his forged paperwork. I kept scrolling. 2 days ago, the house was mostly empty. Then I hit the timestamp for Tuesday evening. Exactly 3 days ago. A thumbnail image flickered to life in the center of the grid. The camera was located in the main living room, pointing directly at my antique cabinet. I clicked the thumbnail to expand the video to full screen. The image was crystal clear, high definition. It was 10 at night. The front door opened and two figures walked into my living room. I turned the volume up on my laptop speakers. The audio was perfectly synchronized. It was Brooke and Chad. They were not wearing the formal clothing I had seen at the rehearsal dinner. They were dressed in casual athletic wear, looking entirely too comfortable in a home they did not own. Brooke tossed her expensive purse onto my sofa and let out a dramatic sigh. "It is finally going to happen now," she said, spinning around in the exact middle of the room. Chad walked straight past her and headed directly for my liquor cabinet. He did not even hesitate. He opened the glass doors with absolute confidence, as if he had been there 100 times before. He reached past the cheap bottles and grabbed a rare single malt scotch that Diana had bought for my 60th birthday, a bottle I had been saving for a truly special occasion. He popped the cork and poured 2 massive glasses without bothering to look for ice. Chad handed a full glass to Brooke. They clinked the heavy crystal tumblers together. "To the easiest payday of my entire life," Chad said, a smug grin plastered across his face. Brooke took a sip and laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed through my empty house. "I cannot believe Derek actually bought the whole story," she said, shaking her head. "He was so terrified of looking broke in front of my friends that he practically begged you to take the house off his hands. He thinks he is a financial genius." Chad took a long drink of my scotch. "Derek is an absolute moron," Chad replied, walking over to my leather armchair and dropping his heavy frame into it. He propped his feet up on the mahogany coffee table, leaving dirty scuff marks on the polished wood. "He literally handed me the deed to $1 million property for half the price, and he thinks I am doing him a massive favor. Once the wedding is over and the ink is dry on that wire transfer, we are going to disappear. And Derek is going to be left standing at the altar with absolutely nothing but a massive charge." Brooke walked over and sat on the arm of the leather chair, wrapping her arm around Chad's neck. She kissed him deeply, right there in the middle of my living room. "I am so glad I do not have to pretend to love that pathetic loser anymore," she whispered. "We take the $485,000 in cash from the insurance policy. We take the $600,000 from the house flip. We catch the first flight to Dubai, and we never look back. He can rot in federal prison for all I care." The old man drops dead. Martin stood behind me watching the screen in absolute horrified silence. He had prosecuted hundreds of criminals, but the sheer callousness of what we were watching was entirely different. It was deeply personal. They were sitting in my house drinking my scotch and casually planning the complete destruction of my family. I did not feel angry. I felt an incredible, terrifying calm. I paused the video, perfectly freezing the frame on their smiling faces. "The digital cloud does not lie, Martin," I said softly. I leaned back in the chair and closed the laptop. The evidence was absolutely flawless now. I pressed the spacebar on the keyboard, and the high-resolution video feed resumed playing immediately. On the screen, Brooke pulled away from Chad and walked over to my dining table. She ran her hand along the polished wood surface, leaving a faint smudge on the finish. She turned back to Chad with a wicked gleam in her eyes. "The best part of this entire plan is how completely insulated we are," she said. Her voice was crystal clear. "Derek is the one who took his father's medical records to that shady notary. Derek is the one who actually signed the forged power of attorney. He is the one who marched into the bank and authorized the wire transfer. My name is not on any paper. If the federal investigators ever catch on, they are going to look straight at the son who came into massive cash before the wedding. He is the perfect shield." Chad laughed, taking another gulp of my vintage scotch. He walked slowly over to the table to join her. "And my name is completely buried behind 3 layers of corporate anonymity," he added. "Apex Holdings will transfer the real estate deed to an overseas buyer by Monday morning. The $600,000 will be washed through offshore accounts before the old man even realizes his locks are changed. We take the $485,000 from the life insurance policy that Derek deposited into the joint account. We drain it all tomorrow night while he is dancing at the reception. We leave his phone in the hotel suite. Our flight to Dubai boards at 2 in the morning. By the time Derek wakes up on Sunday, he will be completely broke, wifeless, and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Brooke smiled a smile so incredibly cold and completely devoid of human empathy. She raised her heavy crystal glass high in the air. To Derek, she mocked. The most gullible groom in the history of the world. They clinked their glasses together again. I watched my future daughter-in-law and her personal trainer casually map out the absolute destruction of my only son. Derek had betrayed me, but he was doing it out of a desire to please a woman who viewed him as a temporary financial stepping stone. He thought he was stealing my legacy to build a life with her. He was digging his own grave and paying for the shovels. I felt a wave of pity for the boy. Not forgiveness, but pity. He was incredibly foolish, and he was about to pay a terrible price for his arrogance. I reached for the mouse and stopped the video playback. The 4,000 pixel resolution captured every micro-expression on their faces. The audio was pristine. A defense attorney could never argue that this was a deep fake. It was a direct, explicit confession of criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and planned evasion of justice. I opened an encrypted protocol. I highlighted the video file and the isolated audio track. With a few deliberate keystrokes, I began the download process. A green progress bar appeared on the screen, slowly inching toward completion. I mirrored the download simultaneously, sending a direct copy to Martin's secure legal server and another copy to an offline physical drive I kept in my briefcase. Martin stood perfectly still behind me. His breathing was incredibly heavy and deliberate. In all my years in the justice system, I have never seen a conspiracy laid out so plainly, he whispered. They are not just thieves. They are sociopaths. They are entirely willing to destroy a man's life just to fund a permanent vacation. Martin walked around the desk and slumped into his chair, rubbing his temples. We need to submit this video to the Cybercrimes Division immediately. This elevates the entire case. It is no longer just your son committing wire fraud. This is a multi-person criminal syndicate executing a coordinated strike against a vulnerable target. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will bring the hammer down on all of them. They will intercept Brooke and Chad at the airport before they ever set foot on that plane to Dubai. I watched the green download bar hit 100%. The files were locked and secured. I quietly closed the remote access window to my hidden home security system. No, Martin, I said calmly. We are not giving this video to the authorities just yet. Martin looked at me in shock. Victor, you have the smoking gun right here. Why would you withhold this from the federal agents? Federal agents operate on a bureaucratic timeline, I explained. They will open a case file. They will assign investigators. They will eventually issue formal subpoenas. By the time they actually move to arrest anyone, the wedding will be over. The damage to my family name will be public and permanent. I do not want them quietly arrested in an airport terminal in the middle of the night. I want them to face the absolute maximum consequence at the exact height of their arrogance. I packed my laptop back into its protective case and secured it inside my bag. I stood up and looked directly at Martin. Derek truly thought he could easily discard me. Brooke thought she could use my son to rob me blind. They both thought they were the smartest people in the room. But I built a career on exposing people who thought they were invincible. I am going to let them put on their expensive clothes. I am going to let them stand in front of their wealthy friends. I am going to let them believe that they have won. And then I am going to tear their entire world apart piece by piece. But before we do that, we need to answer one final question about Chad. Where exactly did a local fitness trainer get $600,000 in cash to buy my house? Martin slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair and pulled the keyboard toward him. That is the exact detail that has been bothering me since I first looked at this file, he said, while typing a rapid series of commands. Personal trainers do not typically have $500,000 of liquid capital sitting in a standard checking account, ready to deploy on a moment's notice. Even a legitimate hard money lender would require a property appraisal and at least 48 hours to underwrite a loan of that size. Chad had to get this cash from a source that completely bypasses the traditional banking sector. A source that does not ask questions and operates strictly in the shadows. I walked around the desk and stood behind his shoulder watching the screen as the forensic software dug into the origin of the $600,000 deposit into the Apex Holdings account. The money did not come from a traditional retail bank. It originated from a small private commercial lending firm located in a dilapidated industrial park just outside the city limits. Martin highlighted the name of the firm. Silver State Financial Services. Do you know them? I asked. Martin let out a low whistle that sounded incredibly strained. I know exactly who they are, Victor, and it makes this entire situation exponentially more volatile. Silver State Financial Services is not a real lending institution. It is a known front company for a very dangerous local syndicate. They operate a massive illegal loan sharking ring, disguised as a high-risk commercial venture capital group. The district attorney has been trying to build a racketeering case against them for 5 years, but they are incredibly violent, and their victims are always entirely too terrified to testify. They provide immediate massive cash loans to desperate people who cannot secure traditional financing. But their interest rates are astronomically high, and their collection methods involve severe physical violence rather than court-ordered asset seizures. Chad did not just borrow money from a bank. He borrowed it from organized criminals. I stared at the screen processing this new variable. Why would a fitness trainer risk his life taking money from a violent syndicate? I asked. Martin tapped his finger against the monitor. Because of the massive profit margins, he explained to me. Chad knew your house was worth over $1 million. He knew Derek was desperate to sell it quickly for $600,000. Chad went to the syndicate and promised them a massive return on a short-term loan. He took their $600,000 and used it to buy the property through his shell company. He probably told the syndicate he would flip the house on the open market next week for its true value of $1.2 million. He would pay back the principal plus an exorbitant amount of interest and still walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure profit. It was a guaranteed win in his mind. He and Brooke would take the house profit, adds it to the $485,000 they stole from your checking account, and disappear to Dubai before the syndicate even realized they were gone. But if something goes wrong with the real estate flip, Chad is personally on the hook for $600,000 to people who will not hesitate to bury him in the desert. The silence in the law office felt heavy and thick. Martin looked up at me, his face pale and tight with genuine concern. Victor, you need to understand the absolute gravity of this situation. If Chad defaults on this loan because we freeze his assets, the syndicate will hunt him down. They will also look for anyone associated with him, including Brooke and potentially your son. We are no longer just dealing with a spoiled kid committing wire fraud. We are intersecting with a violent criminal enterprise. You have to let the federal authorities handle this right now before someone gets killed. I listened to Martin's frantic warning, but I did not feel fear. Instead, a slow, deep smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled since I opened my banking application and saw a zero balance. The dominoes are perfectly aligned, Martin, I whispered. My voice carried a cold and steady resonance that seemed to freeze the air in the room. You look at this syndicate as a dangerous complication, but I look at them as the ultimate instrument of absolute justice. Chad thought he was incredibly clever using cartel money to steal my property. Brooke thought she was a master manipulator playing my son for a fool while securing her golden ticket. They built their entire criminal conspiracy on the assumption that they controlled the board. But they forgot that the money they borrowed is currently trapped in a legal limbo that they cannot possibly escape. When the hammer falls this afternoon, Chad will not just be facing federal wire fraud charges. He will be facing the immediate violent wrath of his creditors. He will have no money, no house, and absolutely nowhere to hide. Brooke will realize that the wealthy, successful man she thought she was running away with is actually a marked target with a massive bounty on his head. And my son will finally understand the true cost of his blinding arrogance. He traded his family for a woman who was willing to feed him to the wolves. I placed my right hand on Martin's shoulder, giving it a firm and reassuring squeeze. "Prepare the final documents," I instructed him. "We are not calling the authorities to stop the wedding. We are going to let the ceremony proceed exactly as planned. We are going to let them stand up there in their expensive clothes and smile for the cameras. And then we are going to burn their entire fraudulent world to the ground in front of everyone they know." Martin stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He looked at my hand resting on his shoulder, and then looked back up into my eyes. "Victor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you are a brilliant man. I know you have built traps for some of the most sophisticated criminals on the planet. But we are talking about your actual house. We are talking about $600,000 of cartel money floating around in the local financial ecosystem. We are talking about your son being in the crosshairs of a violent syndicate. How can you possibly be this calm? How can you just let this play out, knowing that the deed to your home has already been electronically transferred to a shell company?" I pulled my hand back and walked over to the leather chair opposite his desk. I sat down slowly and crossed my legs, resting my hands on my knees. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was now almost 6 in the morning. The sun was fully up, casting a bright, warm light through the office windows. "Martin," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "do you honestly believe that a man who spent his entire professional life designing fail-safes for multinational banks would leave his own personal assets entirely unprotected? Do you really think I just left the original deed to $1 million property sitting in an unlocked filing cabinet in my home office for any greedy relative to snatch?" Martin frowned, furrowing his brow. I saw the transfer documents he countered. The county clerk recorded the sale. The transaction was authenticated. It is a matter of public record now. I nodded, acknowledging his point. "The transaction you saw was recorded based on the documents my son submitted," I explained. "But the documents he submitted were entirely worthless. 5 years ago, when Diana first received her terrible medical diagnosis, I knew our lives were going to change forever. I knew that medical bills could accumulate, and I knew that grief can often make people do very desperate things. I wanted to ensure that no matter what happened to my physical or mental state, her legacy would be absolutely untouchable. So I took every single major asset we owned and I moved it. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my reading glasses, holding them by the frame. I did not just hire a standard estate lawyer, Martin. I used a specialized firm in Delaware to establish an irrevocable blind trust. I transferred the actual legal title of the house, the primary investment accounts, and the central architecture of the life insurance payout directly into that trust. The moment I signed those papers 5 years ago, Victor Gallagher ceased to be the legal owner of that property. The trust became the sole proprietor. I am simply the primary beneficiary and the tenant. My son cannot legally sell a house that I do not even own." Martin let out a sharp gasp and fell back into his chair. His eyes widened as the sheer magnitude of the legal reality washed over him. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "But the paperwork," he stammered. "The deed he gave to the buyers. The bank account numbers he used to move the $485,000. What exactly did he steal?" "He stole a beautifully orchestrated illusion," I replied with a cold smile. "When I set up the blind trust, I knew Derek was careless, and I knew Brooke was incredibly greedy. I anticipated that someday someone might try to pressure me or take advantage of my old age, so I left a trail of dummy documents in the house. The deed Derek found in my desk was a highly accurate replica of the original document from before the trust was formed. The bank account he drained was a superficial holding account. It looks real, it functions like a real account for small daily transactions. but it does not hold the actual principle of my wealth. It is a digital honeypot designed to trigger massive internal alarms the second a withdrawal exceeds a certain threshold. Derek thought he was executing the perfect crime. I continued, leaning forward. He thought he outsmarted his frail old father. But legally speaking, he committed multiple federal felonies to sell a piece of paper that has absolutely zero legal standing. The county clerk recorded the sale yesterday afternoon because the forged signatures looked legitimate on a surface level. But when the title insurance company attempts to verify the deep chain of ownership on Monday morning, the entire transaction will bounce back as completely fraudulent. The property transfer will be automatically nullified by the state. Martin began to laugh. It was a low, disbelieving chuckle that slowly grew into a genuine expression of absolute awe. He shook his head, staring at me as if seeing me for the very first time. "You let him sell a fake house to a real loan shark," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of terror and profound respect. "You let Chad take $600,000 of extremely dangerous cartel money and hand it over for a forged piece of worthless paper." "Exactly," I said, my smile widening just a fraction. "Derek sold a house he had zero legal claim to. Apex Holdings bought an illusion. And because the dummy bank account Derek used to receive that $600,000 is tied to the restricted blind trust security system, that money is now completely frozen by automatic federal banking protocols. Chad cannot get the money back. Derek cannot access the money to run away. Brooke will find out she is marrying a man who is not only completely broke, but is also about to be indicted for wire fraud. They are all trapped in a cage of their own making, and the loan sharks hold the key." Martin turned back to his computer monitor to verify my claim. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the back end of the holding account where the funds had been deposited. The screen illuminated his face with a pale blue light. He navigated through the secure financial portal, bypassing the surface-level ledger that Derek had seen. When he reached the core transaction history, his mouth parted in silent astonishment. Right there on the screen was the inbound transfer of $600,000 from Apex Holdings. But the text was not printed in the standard green font that indicated available liquid funds. It was highlighted in a bold, glaring red block. Across the status bar read a very specific sequence of words: unauthorized external deposit pending federal fraud review, account frozen. I walked over and looked over his shoulder at the glowing red text. "I designed that specific security protocol myself," I explained to him. "I call it the escrow devourer. When a standard checking account suddenly receives a massive influx of cash that does not align with its historical financial profile, a normal bank might just flag it for a manual phone call to the account holder. But this account is directly tethered to the blind trust. The trust operates under strict corporate compliance regulations. The moment Chad initiated that wire transfer, the system automatically identified the incoming funds as a severe anomaly. It did not reject the transfer and send the money back to Chad. That would have given him a chance to recover. Instead, the system accepted the deposit and immediately swallowed it whole, locking it inside a federal holding vault." Martin traced the red block of text with his finger. "The money is effectively paralyzed," he said. "Because the transaction triggered a fraud review, the bank will not release these funds without a full-scale investigation. And since the money originated from a shell company funded by an illegal syndicate, nobody is going to step forward to officially claim it. If Chad tries to call the bank to reverse the wire transfer, they will demand proof of the underlying real estate contract. When they run the title check, they will discover the deed he bought from Derek is a complete forgery. If he pushes the issue, he will be confessing to federal crimes over a recorded bank line. He cannot go forward, and he cannot go backward. He is entirely financially immobilized." I imagined Chad waking up in his expensive downtown apartment this morning. He probably stretched his heavily tattooed arms and smiled, thinking about the beautiful future he had planned with my future daughter-in-law. He probably opened his laptop expecting to see a confirmed property transfer and a clear path to his overseas escape. Instead, He is going to find a digital brick wall. He does not own a $1 million house. He owns a worthless piece of counterfeit paper. The $600,000 he borrowed from violent criminals is completely gone, trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare that he can never legally challenge. He is legally broke, but his debt is very real. The people who run Silver State Financial Services do not care about banking protocols. They do not care about blind trusts or federal fraud reviews. When they handed over that duffel bag of digital cash, they expected a massive return on their investment by next week. They operate on absolute terror and strict deadlines. When Chad fails to produce the title to the house and fails to return their initial principal, they will not file a civil lawsuit in a downtown courthouse. They will send men to his gym. They will send men to his apartment. They will tear his life apart looking for their money. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of real estate flipping, but he was actually walking blindfolded into a minefield. And the most poetic part of this entire situation is that Chad cannot tell Brooke what has happened. If he admits that the money is trapped and the house is a fake, she will instantly realize that her golden ticket has evaporated. She is a parasite who only attaches herself to a wealthy host. Without the cash, Chad is completely useless to her. He knows this. He will try to hide the panic. He will try to pretend everything is going exactly according to their master plan. He will put on his tailored suit, and he will join my son's wedding, carrying the crushing weight of a massive syndicate debt on his shoulders. He will stand in the crowd, sweating profusely, waiting for an opportunity to magically fix an unfixable disaster. Martin leaned back and rubbed his tired eyes. We have armed a bomb and locked them all in the room with it. What do we do now? Do we just wait for the syndicate to figure it out? I stepped away from the desk and walked toward the door of the office. We have spent the entire night gathering the ultimate proof of their unforgivable crimes. The digital trap has successfully closed around them with absolute perfection. No, I replied, picking up my jacket. We are not going to leave this to chance. I have absolutely no intention of hiding in the shadows while they enjoy a luxurious party funded by my stolen legacy. They must face the brutal consequences of their terrible decisions in front of everyone they know. The wedding ceremony begins at 4 o'clock this afternoon at that ridiculous outdoor estate. They are going to serve expensive food and play beautiful music. They are going to celebrate a union built on the total destruction of my family. I am going to go home, change into my best suit, and attend my only son's wedding. I want a front row seat when the realization of what they have done finally washes over them. I want to look directly into their eyes when the walls collapse. I left Martin's law office shortly after sunrise and allowed myself a few hours of much-needed rest at his private downtown apartment. The morning had been a whirlwind of digital forensic work and legal preparation, but the afternoon required a completely different kind of focus. It was now exactly 3 in the afternoon. The extravagant outdoor wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4. I stood in the center of Martin's opulent guest bathroom, staring directly into the large, brightly lit mirror over the marble sink. The face looking back at me was no longer the face of a confused and defeated senior citizen. The exhaustion of the previous night had completely vanished, replaced by a cold and hardened resolve. I turned the brass handle and let the hot water run, splashing it over my face to wash away the last lingering traces of the frail old man I had pretended to be. That pathetic character had served his purpose perfectly. He had drawn out the sheer arrogance of my enemies and convinced them to spring their own traps. But that man was dead now. I walked into the adjoining bedroom where a heavy garment bag was laying across the freshly made bed. Before the movers had completely stripped my home the previous morning, I had quietly packed a single travel bag with a few essential items. Inside that bag was the armor I needed for today. I unzipped the dark canvas slowly and carefully extracted a custom-tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. I had purchased this exact suit 5 years ago for my official corporate retirement party. It was the suit I wore when the board of directors stood and applauded my 3 decades of ruthlessly dismantling financial criminals. The fabric was immaculate, and the cut was dangerously sharp. I slipped into the crisp white dress shirt, buttoning it with steady and deliberate fingers. I fastened the platinum cufflinks Diana had given me on our 20th wedding anniversary. They felt heavy and cold against my wrists, serving as a physical reminder of exactly why I was doing this. I pulled the tailored trousers on and slid my arms into the heavy silk-lined jacket. The fit was absolutely perfect. It instantly changed the entire geometry of my posture. I stepped back and looked at my full reflection in the tall standing mirror near the window. The transformation was absolute and undeniable. I was not a sad, broken father mourning the loss of a son. I was not a helpless victim crying over a stolen inheritance. I was the executioner. I was the living embodiment of the consequences they thought they had so cleverly avoided. I adjusted my silk tie, making sure the knot was perfectly symmetrical. I checked my inner breast pocket to ensure I had my phone, which contained the high-definition video and the isolated audio files. I also reached into my wallet and pulled out the crisp $100 bill that Brooke had shoved into my chest the night before. I folded it neatly and placed it into the front pocket of my trousers. I wanted it close at hand for the grand finale. I picked up my dark sunglasses and my heavy silver watch, securing it tightly around my left wrist. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, air-conditioned breeze of the room. I was entirely ready for war. I walked out of the apartment building and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. A massive black luxury sport utility vehicle was idling quietly at the curb. Martin was sitting in the driver's seat, wearing a sharp navy suit of his own. He looked like a federal agent preparing for a massive dawn raid. I opened the heavy passenger door and climbed inside the spacious leather cabin. The doors locked with a solid and reassuring click. Martin put the vehicle into drive, and we pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the steady flow of weekend traffic. We did not speak. There was absolutely no need for words anymore. The plan was set in stone, and the evidence was entirely bulletproof. We drove out of the dense city center and headed toward the rolling hills of the western suburbs, where the $200,000 estate was located. I watched the expensive neighborhoods roll past my tinted window. Derek and Brooke were probably taking their pre-wedding photographs right now. They were smiling for the cameras, wearing their expensive clothes, completely unaware that the financial ground beneath their feet had already opened up to swallow them whole. They thought today was the beautiful beginning of their wealthy new lives. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest, listening to the quiet hum of the powerful engine. It was not a beginning. It was the absolute end. I thought about the vows they were preparing to recite to one another. They were going to stand in front of a priest and promise to love and cherish each other forever. But their entire relationship was a carefully constructed lie built on a foundation of stolen money and profound betrayal. Chad would be standing somewhere in the crowd, trying to maintain his composure while his phone vibrated with threatening messages from a violent syndicate. Brooke would be holding my son's hands, smiling brightly for the photographer, while secretly counting down the hours until she could abandon him entirely. And Derek would be standing there completely oblivious, believing he had successfully outsmarted his father and secured his golden future. He traded his own flesh and blood for an illusion of wealth and status. I slowly opened my eyes and looked out at the passing trees. The sun was shining brightly, casting long, dramatic shadows across the winding asphalt road. We were rapidly getting closer to the venue now. I reached down and smoothed out the crisp fabric of my charcoal trousers. The final trap was now perfectly set. The heavy black sports utility vehicle crunched softly against the pristine white gravel of the venue parking area. Martin guided the car into a space near the main entrance, purposely blocking a caterer's van to ensure an immediate exit path. I looked through the tinted glass at the sprawling estate. There were massive floral archways composed of thousands of imported white roses spanning across the perfectly manicured green lawns. A gigantic, pristine white tent was erected in the distance for the reception, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the canvas ceiling. 300 guests were seated in perfect rows of velvet chairs, facing a raised wooden platform overlooking a serene private lake. It was a breathtaking display of absolute financial excess, and every single petal had been financed by the complete destruction of my family. I placed my hand on the door handle. Martin looked at me. "Give them hell, Victor," he said quietly. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the warm afternoon. I walked slowly toward the back of the seating area, keeping my footsteps measured. The ceremony was already in its final stages. A soft, elegant melody was being played by a live string quartet seated to the left of the altar. The guests were entirely captivated, staring forward at the beautiful couple. I stopped at the very end of the long white runner that served as the center aisle. From this vantage point, I had a perfect view of the entire fraudulent spectacle. There was my son Derek standing tall in his expensive tuxedo. He held Brooke's hands tenderly, entirely convinced that he was the king of his newly stolen world. Brooke stood opposite him, looking radiant in a custom designer gown. Her smile was incredibly bright, but I knew it was hollow. I scanned the crowd and easily spotted Chad sitting in the third row. He was constantly shifting in his seat, occasionally glancing down at a cell phone hidden in his palm. The loan sharks were likely already trying to reach him. The priest spoke about trust and honesty. The sheer hypocrisy made my chest tight. I could not let him finish that sentence. I took a step forward onto the pristine white fabric of the aisle. Near the back row, there was a small technical table where a young sound engineer was monitoring the audio feed for the priest's microphone and the string quartet. I walked directly over to the table. The young man looked up, completely confused by my sudden appearance. Before he could ask if I needed a seat, she reached down and firmly pulled the main power cable connecting the mixing board to the massive venue speakers. A loud popping sound echoed across the entire estate, followed instantly by absolute dead silence. The string quartet stopped playing in sheer shock. The priest's voice was completely cut off, leaving him mouthing words into a dead microphone. 300 heads turned simultaneously to look toward the back of the lawn. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests. I stepped back into the exact center of the white runner. I stood perfectly straight, my tailored charcoal suit cutting a sharp contrast. I began to walk down the aisle, keeping my eyes locked dead ahead on the altar. At the front of the platform, Derek peered past the rows of guests, trying to see what had caused the disruption. When his eyes finally found me, his entire physical demeanor collapsed. The confident, proud groom completely vanished. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child. He dropped Brooke's hands, taking a stumbling step backward. He was staring at a ghost, a man he thought he had successfully buried the night before. But the shock only lasted for a few seconds, before it was replaced by pure, frantic fury. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He turned toward the perimeter of the lawn and began gesturing wildly to a pair of burly private security guards hired to keep the event exclusive. "Get him out of here!" Derek shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Remove him right now!" Brooke spun around, her heavy dress twisting violently. The perfect fake smile was instantly replaced by a mask of absolute hatred. She leaned forward, gripping her bridal bouquet tightly. "What are you doing here, you crazy old man?" she screamed. "Someone get this broke, pathetic loser out of my wedding right now." The two security guards began to jog down the side aisles to intercept me. Murmurs of confusion and alarm spread rapidly through the seated guests. People were whispering, asking each other who I was and why I was ruining the day. Chad stood up in the third row, his face a mixture of confusion and dread. I ignored all of them. I ignored the guards closing in. I ignored my sons, frantic shouting. I ignored the bride screaming insults at me from the altar. I kept walking, stepping firmly onto the first wooden stair of the raised platform. The priest instinctively took a step back, holding his hands up in a defensive gesture. The wedding singer, a young woman in a modest black dress, was standing frozen near her microphone stand on the right side of the stage. I walked directly past Derek, who was now frozen in absolute terror, and stepped right up to the singer. "Excuse me," I said softly, reaching out my hand. She was so shocked by my calm, authoritative presence that she simply let go of the microphone and stepped away. I gripped the heavy metal handle of the microphone. I turned around to face my son, my future daughter-in-law, and their 300 horrified guests. The security guards reached the bottom of the stairs, but stopped completely unsure of whether to tackle an elderly man in a custom suit. I looked directly at Derek, who was shaking with rage. I brought the microphone up to my mouth. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice in anger. I held the microphone close to my mouth and spoke with a voice so profoundly calm that it sent a visible shiver through the front rows of the audience. "Derek," I said, allowing the massive speakers to carry my words across the quiet lake. "You told me yesterday that I was a confused old man. You told me to go find a cheap motel and wait for a nursing home. You said you were taking control of my assets to protect my future." I watched him swallow hard, his throat bobbing nervously above his tight bow tie. Brooke stepped slightly behind him, using him as a physical shield. Her eyes were darting toward the security guards, silently begging them to intervene. But the guards simply stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, entirely captivated by the bizarre drama unfolding before them. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. For a brief second, several people in the crowd gasped, perhaps thinking I was reaching for a weapon. But I simply pulled out my smartphone. I brought it up to eye level and unlocked the screen. "I am not here to make a scene." I continued, my voice echoing off the white canvas of the reception tent. "I am simply here to deliver my wedding gift." I noticed a thick black auxiliary audio cable resting on the technical table beside the singer's stand. It was the input line used to play the instrumental backing tracks. I walked over and picked up the metal connector. I plugged it directly into the bottom of my phone. A low static hum vibrated through the massive speaker system, indicating a live connection. The entire venue fell into a state of absolute suspended animation. Not a single person moved. The gentle rustling of the wind through the imported white roses was the only natural sound left in the world. I opened my encrypted file manager and selected the audio track I had downloaded in Martin's office just hours ago. It was the pristine, high-definition audio recording from my living room camera. I looked directly at Brooke. Her face was completely drained of color. She realized what was happening, but she was entirely paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. I pressed the play button on my screen. For 2 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of digital silence. Then a voice boomed across the $200,000 estate. It was Brooke's voice, perfectly clear and undeniably authentic. "It is finally going to happen now." The recorded voice of Brooke echoed over the perfectly manicured lawns. A second voice joined hers. It was the deep, arrogant tone of Chad. "To the easiest payday of my entire life," Chad said, through the speakers, followed by the sharp, clinking sound of my crystal Scotch glasses. I stood perfectly still, watching the catastrophic realization hit the 300 guests simultaneously. The recording continued, broadcasting their absolute treachery to the wealthy crowd. "I cannot believe Derek actually bought the whole story," the recorded. Brooke laughed, her voice sounding harsh and incredibly cruel, amplified at this volume. "He thinks he is a financial genius." The crowd let out a collective gasp of pure horror. Women covered their mouths in shock. Men stared in absolute disbelief. Then Chad's recorded voice delivered the final devastating blow. "Derek is an absolute moron," Chad declared over the speakers. "He literally handed me the deed to $1 million property for half the price. Once the wedding is over and the ink is dry on that wire transfer, we are going to disappear. And Derek is going to be left standing at the altar with absolutely nothing but a massive charge. The audio recording continued without any mercy. "We take the $485,000 in cash from the insurance policy," Brooke confessed loudly to the entire world. "We take the $600,000 from the house flip. Our flight to Dubai boards at 2 in the morning. By the time Derek wakes up on Sunday, he will be completely broke, wifeless, and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment." I reached down and pulled the audio cable from my phone, cutting the recording off. The sudden silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than any noise I had ever experienced. It was the sound of a completely destroyed reality. I looked back at the altar. Derek was no longer flushed with anger. His face was a mask of absolute hollow devastation. He slowly turned his head to look at Brooke, the woman he had betrayed his own father for, the woman he thought he was building a golden empire with. Brooke was physically shaking. She raised her hands defensively, shaking her head side to side, trying to mouth the words that it was fake, but no sound came out. The evidence was far too perfect, and the voices were entirely undeniable. Derek looked down at his hand, which was still lightly touching hers. He pulled his hand away violently, as if her skin was suddenly made of burning acid. He stumbled backward, almost tripping over the train of her expensive designer dress. He clutched his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow. "Brooke, look at me." Derek gasped, his voice breaking completely. "Tell me that is not real. Tell me you did not plan to leave me with a federal felony." Brooke simply began to cry. Not tears of remorse, but tears of a trapped animal realizing the cage had slammed shut. In the third row of the guest seating, a sudden movement caught the corner of my eye. Chad had realized that his entire scheme was violently exposed. He knew the bride was ruined and the money was gone. He slowly stood up from his velvet chair, trying to keep his head down. He began quickly shuffling sideways down the long, carpeted row. I watched Chad moving desperately toward the edge of the seating area, trying to slip away into the shadows of the large white reception tent. I brought the microphone back up to my lips. "Going somewhere, Chad?" I asked, my voice cutting through the thick silence like a sharpened blade. Every single head in the audience snapped around to look at the muscular fitness trainer who was now frozen halfway down the aisle. "You might want to stay exactly where you are," I advised him. "The exits are no longer a viable option for you." I turned my attention back to my son. Derek was staring at the ground, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the monumental collapse of his entire reality. He looked up at me, his eyes begging for some sort of reprieve, begging for this to be a terrible nightmare, but there was no mercy left in my heart for the boy who had tried to erase me. "You thought you were incredibly clever, Derek." I said, my words rolling across the quiet lake behind him. "You thought you could just declare me incompetent and liquidate my entire life to pay for this ridiculous charade. You went into my home office and you found the deed to my house. You took it to a shady buyer thinking you were making the ultimate real estate deal. You thought you sold my house to fund your new perfect life." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. The security guards had completely backed away, realizing they were witnessing a family execution rather than a physical threat. "Let me educate you on how real wealth is actually protected, Derek. The deed you stole was nothing but a high-quality replica. It was a dummy document I kept in my desk for exactly this kind of foreseeable betrayal. 5 years ago, I transferred all of my major assets, including the actual legal title to that property, into an irrevocable blind trust. I do not legally own that house anymore, and neither do you. You forged my signature on a temporary power of attorney that had been expired for 8 months to sell a property that you had absolutely zero legal claim to. You did not sell a $1 million estate to a private buyer. You committed massive document forgery and sold a worthless piece of paper to a shell company." Derek swayed on his feet, visibly dizzy from the relentless barrage of truth. He reached out to grab the wooden railing of the altar to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The guests were whispering frantically to each other, now the scandal completely consuming the wealthy crowd. Brooke was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands covering her face, her expensive makeup running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. But I was not finished dismantling his stolen empire. And then there is the matter of the $485,000. I continued, raising my voice just enough to silence the murmuring crowd. You thought you could just wire $500,000 of your dead mother's life insurance money across state lines without triggering a single alarm. You thought my banking security was as weak as your moral compass. That money did not just quietly settle into your new joint account in Texas. Because of the security protocols I personally established, that massive transfer was immediately flagged as a severe anomaly. I reported the fraudulent transaction to the authorities late last night. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division officially opened a case at 3 o'clock this morning. You did not just steal from your father, Derek. You committed federal wire fraud. That is a major felony carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. The federal authorities have completely frozen the destination accounts. You cannot access a single penny of that money. You are completely broke. You have no house. You have no wife because she was planning to abandon you at the airport tonight. And you are going to federal prison. At that exact moment, a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the heavy tension of the outdoor venue. It was a cell phone ringing violently. It was not coming from the altar. It was coming from the third row. Chad desperately grabbed at his jacket pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he pulled out his vibrating phone. The screen was glowing brightly in the dimming afternoon light. He stared at the caller identification, and his face drained of whatever color it had left. The phone continued to ring, echoing loudly across the silent estate. "Go ahead and answer it, Chad," I suggested, pointing directly at him. "Tell the people from Silver State Financial Services why their $600,000 is currently trapped in a frozen federal holding account. Tell the violent loan sharks you borrowed that money from that the house you bought is a fake and you have absolutely no way to pay them back." Chad's phone kept ringing, a relentless mechanical scream that signaled his absolute doom. He looked around wildly, realizing the devastating truth. The money was gone. The house was an illusion. The federal government was watching the accounts, and the cartel was calling to collect their debt. He dropped the phone onto the grass as if it were burning his hand. The ringing finally stopped, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. The trap had closed perfectly around all three of them, leaving absolutely no avenue for escape. The 300 guests remained completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction unfolding before them. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to move. Derek slowly sank to his knees right there on the wooden platform. He buried his face in his trembling hands and finally began to weep. It was the pathetic sound of a broken man who realized he had traded his loyal family for an absolute nightmare of lies and guaranteed prison time. My judgment was complete. The profound silence that had completely blanketed the outdoor estate was suddenly shattered. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing from the winding canyon roads leading up to the property. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and grew deafeningly loud. The distinct, aggressive scream of multiple police sirens tore through the warm afternoon air. The 300 guests, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly began to panic, but the authorities did not politely park at the front gates. 3 massive, unmarked black sports utility vehicles suddenly crashed through the decorative wooden fencing at the edge of the property. They did not slow down to preserve the expensive landscaping. The heavy tires tore deep, ugly trenches into the perfectly manicured green lawn, sending chunks of mud and crushed white rose petals flying into the air. The vehicles swerved aggressively around the seating area and skidded to a violent halt directly in front of the raised wooden altar. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their chests poured out onto the grass. This was a coordinated federal raid. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face, pointed directly at the altar. "Nobody moves," he shouted, his voice easily carrying over the lingering wails of the sirens. "Secure the perimeter and identify the primary targets." Two agents sprinted up the wooden stairs of the platform. Derek was still kneeling on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He did not even attempt to run or fight back. He was completely broken. An agent grabbed him roughly by the shoulder, pulling him up to his feet. "Derek Gallagher, you are under arrest for suspicion of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud," the agent recited while forcefully spinning my son around. Derek offered zero resistance as the cold steel handcuffs were clamped tightly over his expensive tuxedo cuffs. He looked at me one last time, but I offered him absolutely no comfort. I stared back at him with the cold, detached gaze of a man who was simply watching a criminal being processed. His shoulders slumped forward in utter defeat. Down in the grass near the third row, Chad was having a very different reaction. When the agents approached him, his fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. He tried to shove past a federal officer to make a run for the reception tent. But Chad was a fitness trainer built for looking good in mirrors, not a trained combatant. Two agents tackled him instantly, driving him hard into the muddy trenches left by the vehicles. They pinned his heavily tattooed arms behind his back and secured him in heavy restraints. He shouted obscenities, but his voice was trembling with the absolute certainty of his impending doom. On the altar, Brooke was watching her entire universe violently disintegrate. The wealthy guests she had tried so desperately to impress were now pulling out their cell phones, filming the humiliating spectacle. Her brand was permanently destroyed. The money was completely gone. The man she was using was in handcuffs, and her secret lover was pinned face down in the mud. The sheer terror of her reality finally broke her carefully constructed facade. She dropped her expensive bridal bouquet, allowing the delicate flowers to scatter across the wooden planks. She stumbled forward, her heavy designer gown dragging behind her. She threw herself entirely onto her knees, right at my feet. The pristine white silk of her dress instantly absorbed the dirt from the stage. "Victor. Please," she sobbed hysterically, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her makeup was entirely ruined, making her look like a terrifying, ghostly apparition. "You have to tell them I had nothing to do with this. You have to save me." It was all Chad. He manipulated me. He forced me to go along with it. I never wanted to hurt you. I love Derek. Please, Victor, you cannot let them take me to prison. I cannot survive in a place like that. She reached out with her trembling hands, grabbing the bottom of my tailored suit trousers, her fingers clutching the expensive fabric like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. She was willing to throw everyone under the bus just to save her own skin. She cried harder, begging for any tiny shred of mercy. She promised to testify against the men she claimed to love if I would just speak to the federal agents on her behalf. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the dirt at my feet. I did not feel a single shred of sympathy. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of disgust. I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my trousers, stepping back to create a physical distance between us. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure she could hear every single syllable clearly. You made your choices, Brooke. I said, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. You orchestrated the theft of a dead woman's legacy. You mocked my supposed illness. You sat in my living room and laughed while you planned the total destruction of my family. I reached into the front pocket of my trousers. My fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper I had kept exactly for this moment. I pulled it out and slowly unfolded it, smoothing the creases. It was the crisp, new $100 bill she had shoved into my chest the night before. I held it between my index and middle fingers, just like she had done. I looked into her sobbing, desperate eyes. I let the bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered gracefully through the air, catching a brief breeze before landing softly directly in her lap. You should take a taxi, Brooke, I said, my voice cold and absolute. Your perfect aesthetic is completely ruined. 6 months have passed since that spectacular afternoon. The crisp autumn air has now settled over Austin, bringing a quiet peace that I have not felt in a very long time. I am sitting on the front porch of my home. The same home that was stripped bare by careless movers is now completely restored. Every piece of antique furniture, every painting, and every memory has been returned to its rightful place. The heavy mahogany console table sits exactly where Diana and I placed it 40 years ago. The polished wood gleams under the soft morning light, reminding me that some foundations simply cannot be broken. I hold a steaming cup of black coffee in my hands, watching the morning sun filter through the leaves of the large oak tree in the front yard. The house is quiet, but it no longer feels hollow. It feels incredibly safe. The storm that ripped through my life has finally passed, leaving behind a perfectly clear sky. The justice system moved with surprising speed once the evidence was presented. Derek did not even attempt to fight the charges. When faced with the undeniable audio recordings, the forged documents, and the massive wire fraud evidence, his public defender advised him to take a plea deal. My son, the boy who thought he was a financial genius, is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. He writes me letters occasionally. The envelopes arrive stamped with the strict seal of the federal prison system. I read them carefully, but I do not reply. The letters are full of desperate apologies, but they read more like the regrets of a man who is incredibly sorry. He got caught rather than a man who is truly sorry for what he did. He constantly complains about the harsh reality of his concrete cell and the complete loss of his luxurious lifestyle. Perhaps in 5 long years, he will finally learn the absolute value of an honest dollar. Brooke did not fare much better. She tried desperately to spin a false narrative of victimhood, claiming she was entirely brainwashed by the terrible men in her life. The federal prosecutors did not believe a single word of her tearful performance. She is currently under an intense federal investigation for criminal conspiracy, and her precious social media aesthetic is completely obliterated. The wealthy friends she tried so hard to impress completely abandoned her the exact moment the handcuffs came out. Nobody wanted to be associated with a high-profile federal fraud case. She now lives in a tiny, cramped apartment working a grueling minimum-wage retail job just to pay her constantly mounting legal fees. Every day is a bitter reminder of the incredible wealth she threw away out of sheer endless greed. As for Chad, his fate was decided entirely outside the traditional courtroom. When the federal government seized the fraudulent holding account, the $600,000 he borrowed from Silver State Financial Services was permanently confiscated as illegal proceeds of a severe financial crime. The incredibly violent loan sharks did not care about federal holds or official court orders. They only cared that their massive investment was completely gone. Chad practically vanished into thin air exactly 3 days after the disastrous wedding ceremony. Rumor has it he fled the state entirely, leaving behind his leased luxury cars and his failing fitness business. He is spending the entire rest of his miserable life constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at every single shadow, knowing the cartel will never stop hunting him down. He traded a secure, comfortable life for a quick payout and successfully bought himself a permanent waking nightmare. A sleek black car pulls into my driveway, interrupting my quiet reflections. Martin steps out carrying a thick leather briefcase. He walks up the familiar stone steps and hands me a pristine stack of formal legal documents. "Good morning, Victor," he says with a very warm, genuine smile. "Today is the day, my friend." I set my warm coffee down on the table and take the heavy silver pen he offers me. The crisp white papers in front of me represent the absolute culmination of my sacred promise to Diana. The federal court not only fully restored the stolen $485,000 to my primary account, but they also released the seized $600,000 cartel funds as direct restitution for the severe emotional and financial damages inflicted upon my estate. With a few precise, deliberate strokes of the pen, I sign the final establishing charters. The massive sum of money is officially transferred. The defunct community center on the east side of town has been completely purchased and fully renovated to the highest possible standards. Next week, we will cut the bright red ribbon and officially open the doors to the Diana Gallagher Youth Shelter. It will serve as a safe haven for innocent children who have nowhere else to go. Children who desperately deserve a chance to build a real family. It is a legacy of absolute kindness, beautifully built from the terrible ashes of profound human greed. I hand the signed legal documents back to Martin. He respectfully nods his head in deep admiration and quietly returns to his idling car, leaving me completely alone with my final thoughts. I look out over the beautiful garden Diana planted so many years ago. The bright flowers are blooming against the crisp autumn chill. I think about the chaotic journey of the last 6 months. I think about the absolute betrayal, the silent, meticulous investigation, and the devastating execution of justice. I did not ask for this war, but when it arrived at my doorstep, I fought it with every ounce of my experience. They thought my silence was weakness. They forgot that a silent calculator is just adding up the cost of your ruin. Family isn't blood. It's respect. And at 71, my life isn't over. It's just been properly audited.